The sound of laughter filled the restaurant, echoing off the polished marble walls. Expensive suits, fine wine, and fake smiles, the perfect setting for my son to show off. I sat quietly at the end of the long table, my calloused hands resting on the edge of my chair, a worn jacket hanging loosely from my shoulders. It was his company's anniversary dinner, the business he built, or so everyone thought. "Dad," he said loudly, tapping his glass with a fork to get everyone's attention. "You all know this man here, my father, the reason I learned what not to do in life." The crowd laughed politely, unsure how to react. My throat tightened. I looked around at the faces of his colleagues, all trying to hide their discomfort. My son, Ethan, smirked. "He used to fix shoes for a living," he continued, his tone dripping with arrogance. Imagine that, patching up other people's souls while I was dreaming of luxury cars and skyscrapers. But hey, that's where I got my motivation from, to never end up like him. I felt a sting deep in my chest, but I didn't say a word. I simply smiled, though it took everything in me not to walk out right there. My wife, God rest her soul, always told me, "Pride doesn't heal pain, Robert. Let life do that." I watched as Ethan raised his glass to a round of applause. "To hard work and ambition," he toasted, and they all clinked glasses. No one noticed the old man sitting in silence, his son's laughter echoing in his ears. After dinner, as we walked out to the parking lot, I finally spoke. "You didn't need to humiliate me, son." He rolled his eyes. "Oh, Dad, come on. Don't be so dramatic. It was a joke. You wouldn't understand how people talk in my world." "Your world," I repeated quietly. "I see." He adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at his expensive watch, and sighed. "Look, I'll call you later, okay? I've got a meeting in the morning." I nodded. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." He drove off in his sleek black car, leaving me standing there under the flickering streetlight. I looked at my reflection in the restaurant window, the wrinkles, the gray hair, the eyes tired from years of work. I had spent my life trying to give him everything I never had, and now I was nothing more than a reminder of what he wanted to forget. When I got home, the little apartment felt colder than usual. I sat by the window, listening to the city hum outside. On the table lay a framed photo, Ethan as a little boy, smiling as he held the first pair of shoes I'd ever made for him. For my little man, I had written on the box, "May you always walk proudly." Proudly. That word hurt now. Days turned into weeks, and I didn't hear from him. I spent my days fixing shoes for the neighborhood, old leather, cracked soles, worn heels. Most people didn't even know my name, just Mr. Cobbler. But I didn't mind. Every repair I made felt like a small piece of dignity stitched back together. One evening, a young boy came into my shop with torn sneakers. "Mister, can you fix these for me? Mom said we can't buy new ones." I smiled. "Of course, son. Come back tomorrow and they'll be good as new." As I worked that night, something inside me softened. Maybe life wasn't about being recognized or respected. Maybe it was just about doing good. Quietly, faithfully. But fate, it seems, has a strange way of turning circles. It was a cold evening in December when I got the call. A voice I hadn't heard in months. "Dad, it's me." Ethan's tone was low, shaky, a far cry from the confident man who once boasted in front of hundreds. "Are you okay?" I asked, heart pounding. I need help," he said quietly. "Please." The last word hung in the air like a confession. Within an hour, I was in a taxi heading across the city. The driver's radio played softly, a love song from the 80 Seconds. I stared out the window, my mind racing. What could have happened to him? When I arrived, the address he gave me led to a nearly empty building, his company headquarters, or what was left of it. The glass doors were shattered, the lights dimmed, and the air smelled faintly of dust and desperation. I found him in his office, sitting on the floor, surrounded by stacks of papers and overturned chairs. His suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He looked up when I walked in. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking. I looked around. The once mighty empire he had built now looked like a graveyard of failed ambition. "What happened?" I asked softly. He swallowed hard, his eyes red. "The investors pulled out. The partners left. I trusted the wrong people, and they took everything." I took a slow breath, my heart aching. "Everything?" He nodded. "Even the house. They froze my accounts." I have nowhere to go." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with years of unspoken words, his pride, my patience, and the distance that had grown like a wall. Finally, I said, "Come home, son." He looked up, tears welling. "After everything I said? After how I treated you?" I nodded. "You're still my boy." And that night, for the first time in years, Ethan came back to the same small apartment he once called home, the place he had tried so hard to forget. As he stepped inside, he paused, looking around at the old photos on the wall, the worn furniture, the faint smell of polish and leather. "I can't believe I'm back here," he whispered. I smiled faintly. "Sometimes we need to return to where we started to remember who we are." He said nothing more, but I saw it, the shame, the regret, the beginning of understanding in his eyes. Little did I know, that night was only the start of the lesson life had prepared for him. The first few days with Ethan back home were awkward, quiet, and heavy with unsaid things. I could feel the discomfort in the air. He wasn't used to this simplicity anymore. No fancy coffee machines, no city skyline from the window, no people waiting to take his calls. Just an old man's apartment that smelled of shoe polish, coffee, and memory. He'd sit on the couch most mornings, staring at his phone even though it barely rang anymore. I'd watch him from my workbench as I repaired a pair of boots, pretending not to notice the frustration building inside him. One morning he finally spoke. "Dad, I don't get it. How can you live like this?" I looked up, wiping my hands on a rag. "Like what?" "In this tiny place, with nothing. Don't you ever feel like you failed?" I chuckled softly. "Failed? No, son. I worked, I ate, I slept under a roof. I loved your mother until her last breath. If that's failure, I'll take it." He sighed, leaning back. "I guess I don't see it that way." "I know," I said quietly. "You were too busy chasing more to ever see enough." He didn't reply. He just stared at the wall, lost in thought. Days passed, and he began helping me around the shop. At first, it was reluctant. He'd sweep the floor carelessly, sighing as if every speck of dust was beneath him. But slowly, I noticed something changing. One afternoon, I caught him watching me repair an old pair of boots with curious eyes. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Fix something that's already broken. Like, it's nothing." I smiled faintly. "Because I don't see it as broken. I see what it can still become." He nodded slowly, almost to himself. That was the first crack in his wall of pride. A few nights later, as we ate dinner, plain soup and bread, he asked, "Dad, do you ever regret not doing more with your life? I mean, you could have built a business, hired people, made something big." I looked at him and said, "I did build something big, Ethan. Your mother and I worked every day to give you the chance to dream. That was our business. You just forgot who the real investors were." He looked down, his spoon frozen halfway to his mouth. The silence between us was thick, but it wasn't the old kind of silence. It was the heavy, meaningful kind that follows realization. That night, I lay awake in bed, thinking about how life had flipped our roles. I once carried him when he was small, guiding him through fear and mistakes. Now, I was watching him stumble through the consequences of his own arrogance, praying he'd find his way back to humility. In the following weeks, Ethan began showing small changes. He stopped sleeping in. He started helping customers at the shop, shyly at first, awkwardly greeting them. I noticed how some of the older clients smiled at him, probably recognizing a younger version of me in his eyes. One afternoon, an elderly woman came in with a broken purse strap. She was frail, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the counter. "Can you fix it, dear?" she asked. Before I could answer, Ethan nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Leave it to me." He took it to the workbench and fumbled with the tools, nearly breaking the buckle. I tried not to laugh. "Easy there," I said, walking over. "You don't force the metal, you listen to it. Every mark tells you what it needs." He watched closely as I worked, the same way he used to when he was a boy. When the job was done, the old woman smiled and handed him a few bills. Ethan shook his head. "No, it's okay. You don't have to pay." She smiled softly. "Oh, but I do. Not for the repair, for the kindness." When she left, Ethan just stood there quietly, the money still in his hand. "Feels different, doesn't it?" I asked. He nodded slowly. Yeah, it does. That evening, as we locked up the shop, he said something I hadn't expected. Dad, I used to think money was the only thing that proved a man's worth. But seeing how people trust you, respect you, maybe worth isn't about numbers after all. I smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. No, son. Worth is about what you give, not what you keep. A few days later, as if life wanted to test his newfound humility, someone knocked on our door, a man in a tailored suit. He was one of Ethan's former business associates. Ethan, the man said coldly, I need you to sign these. Legal documents. The bankruptcy settlements are final. Ethan's face went pale. You're taking everything? Everything tied to your name, the man said, glancing briefly at me with mild disdain. Sorry, that's how business works. He handed Ethan the papers and walked out without another word. Ethan sank onto the couch, the papers trembling in his hands. It's all gone, he whispered. Every last thing. I sat beside him. Then maybe it's time to build something that can't be taken. He looked at me, confusion clouding his eyes. Like what? Character, son, I said. No one can repossess that. That night, he didn't eat. He just sat by the window, staring into the darkness. I wanted to say something, but I knew this was a storm he had to weather alone. Life was giving him the same lesson I'd tried to teach for years, only now it was written in pain. The next morning, I woke to the sound of movement in the workshop. When I peeked in, Ethan was already there, sleeves rolled up, trying to fix an old pair of boots. Morning, he said softly. Morning, I replied, surprised. You're up early, he smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd start learning. And that was the moment I knew. Something in him had shifted. Life had finally done what my words never could. It had humbled him. Over the next few weeks, the rhythm of our days changed. Ethan was no longer the man who walked into my home full of pride and resentment. He was quieter now, more observant. Sometimes, I'd catch him staring at his hands, as if trying to remember who he used to be. He began taking small repair jobs seriously. The same son who once mocked me for wasting time on old shoes, now carefully mended soles, polished leather, and smiled when customers thanked him. But every evening, after we closed the shop, he'd linger by the counter, lost in thought. One night, I finally asked, "What's on your mind, son?" He hesitated, then said, "Do you think people can really change, Dad?" I looked at him for a moment, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes. "I think people don't change because they have to. They change when they hurt enough to want to." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Then maybe I'm changing for the right reasons." That was the first time I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Humility, raw and real. A few days later, an opportunity came that would test that new humility. A woman walked into the shop holding a large, scuffed leather briefcase. She was dressed well, professional, confident. She placed it on the counter and smiled. "I heard this is the best repair shop in town. Can you fix it?" I smiled politely. "We'll do our best, ma'am." Ethan looked up, his face suddenly pale. He knew her. "Ethan?" she said in surprise. "Is that really you?" "Clara," he murmured. "Wow, it's been years." The air grew heavy. Clara had once worked for Ethan, his assistant, back when he ran his company. I remembered her name only because he used to brag about firing her for being too slow. Clara looked around the shop, her eyes landing on me before turning back to him. "So this is where you've been?" Ethan forced a weak smile. "Yeah, life took some turns," she nodded, sympathy softening her tone. "I heard about the bankruptcy. I'm sorry. That must have been hard." Ethan just nodded, unable to speak. When she left, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the repaired briefcase she'd promised to pick up later. I could see the storm brewing inside him. Shame, regret, guilt. Finally, he said quietly, "Dad, she was one of the people I treated terribly. I thought I was doing what leaders were supposed to do, being tough. But I was just cruel." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe it's time to make things right." That evening, he stayed late in the shop, cleaning and restoring Clara's briefcase as if it were made of gold. Every stitch, every polished stroke, it wasn't just a repair job anymore. It was redemption in motion. When Clara returned the next day, she was surprised to see Ethan waiting by the counter. He handed her the briefcase and said softly, "I owe you an apology. Not for what happened with your bag, for what I did years ago. I was arrogant, and I hurt good people like you. I'm sorry." Clara blinked, taken aback. For a moment, she said nothing, then smiled gently. "Ethan, that means more than you think. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn." She turned to leave, but before she did, she looked at me and said, "You raised a good man, Mr. Collins. Maybe he just took the scenic route to find himself." After she left, Ethan stood there silently, his eyes misty. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. I could see it written all over his face. He'd finally forgiven himself. But life, as always, wasn't done testing him. A week later, I fell ill. Nothing too serious at first, just fatigue, a cough that wouldn't quit. But soon, it got worse. My hands trembled, my breath grew short, and I could barely stand at the workbench. Ethan rushed me to the hospital. Sitting beside my bed, I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear I'd felt when he was a child with a fever. "Dad, you'll be okay," he said, holding my hand. "I promise I'll take care of everything." I smiled weakly. "I know you will." The days in the hospital were a blur. Machines beeped, nurses moved like shadows, and time felt heavy. But through it all, Ethan never left my side. He brought food, stayed late, and even managed the shop on his own. One evening, I woke up to find him dozing in the chair beside me, his head resting against the wall. My heart swelled with quiet pride. That was my son, not the man of wealth and ego he once was, but the man I'd always hoped he'd become. When I was discharged, I returned home to find the shop spotless, the shelves organized, and a new sign outside that read, "Collins & Son Shoe Repair, serving with heart." I stood there staring at it, my throat tight. Ethan walked up behind me. "Thought we could make it official," he said. I turned to him, unable to hold back the tears. "You have no idea how proud I am of you, son." He smiled faintly. "Guess I just needed to lose everything to find what mattered." I nodded. Sometimes the only way up is to fall first. From that day on, we worked side by side, not as a father trying to save his son, but as two men finally understanding each other. The months rolled by quietly, almost too quietly. The shop had never been busier. Customers came not just for repairs, but for the warmth they felt inside our little corner of the world. People brought their old, worn-out belongings, and somehow they always left lighter, as if they were leaving a little of their pain behind too. Ethan had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. He laughed more, listened more, and even started keeping a small notebook in which he wrote thoughts about life, gratitude, and the things money could never buy. Sometimes I'd catch him reading it quietly between customers. But every transformation comes with one final test. One afternoon, a sleek black car pulled up outside the shop. A man in a designer suit stepped out, confident, arrogant, and instantly out of place among the modest surroundings. He pushed the door open and walked in, his cologne hitting the air before his voice did. "Well, well, Ethan Collins. Didn't think I'd find you here." Ethan froze. Victor was his former business partner, the one who had manipulated him into signing the papers that led to his downfall. The one who walked away with everything while Ethan took the blame. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his tone calm but cold. Victor smirked. "Relax. I'm not here to gloat. Actually, I came to offer you something." "An offer?" Victor looked around the shop with mild disgust. "Yeah, I'm launching a new company. Could use someone with your experience. We had our differences, but you were always sharp. I'll make it worth your while. Generous pay, bonuses, city life again. What do you say?" For a long moment, Ethan didn't respond. I watched from behind the counter, my heart pounding. This was it, the real test. He glanced around the shop, at the tools, the wooden shelves, the soft hum of the radio in the corner. Then he looked at me. Finally, he turned back to Victor and said quietly, "I appreciate the offer, but no, this is where I belong." Victor blinked, surprised. "Here? Fixing shoes?" Ethan smiled softly. "Fixing lives too, starting with my own." Victor laughed bitterly. "You've lost it, man. You could have had everything again. I already do, Ethan said. Peace, purpose, family, things you wouldn't understand. Victor scoffed, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out, the sound of the doorbell echoing like a closing chapter. When he was gone, Ethan turned to me, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Guess I passed the final exam, huh? I laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. You didn't just pass, son. You rewrote the course. That evening, we sat outside the shop, watching the sunset spill gold across the quiet street. Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, You know, Dad, when I was rich, I thought happiness was something you could buy. Now, I realize it's something you earn, one honest day at a time. I nodded slowly. You finally understand what I tried to tell you all those years. He smiled. Yeah, I just wish I'd listened sooner. Doesn't matter, I said. You found your way. That's all that counts. For the first time in years, I felt like my job as a father was complete. But life, in its quiet wisdom, wasn't done writing our story. A few weeks later, I received a letter from the town council. They wanted to honor me for decades of service to the community. At first, I refused. I didn't like attention. But Ethan insisted we go. You've spent your life fixing everyone's souls, Dad. Maybe it's time they fixed your soul a little too. The ceremony was small but heartfelt. Old customers, friends, neighbors, they all came. When my name was called, I stood up slowly, feeling the years in my knees but strength in my heart. Ethan stood beside me, smiling proudly. As I accepted the plaque, I said, This shop was never just about repairing shoes. It was about giving people something to stand on, hope, dignity, and second chances. I didn't do it alone. My son has taught me as much as I ever taught him. The crowd clapped, and Ethan's eyes glistened. Later, when we got home, he placed the plaque on the shelf above the counter and said quietly, You know, Dad, I think Mom would have been proud. I looked at him, my throat tight. She is, son, every day. In the weeks that followed, the shop became something more, a place where stories lived. People started dropping by not just for repairs, but to talk, to share, to listen. Ethan even started filming short videos, telling little stories about kindness and redemption, inspired by what he'd lived through. One evening, he showed me a clip on his phone. In it, he said, This is my father. He taught me that strength isn't about money or power. It's about patience, love, and forgiveness. I once mocked him for being poor, but now I realize he was the richest man I've ever known. When I heard those words, tears blurred my vision. I couldn't speak. All I could do was pull him into a hug. For years, I'd prayed that he'd see the truth. And now, he was not only living it, he was sharing it with the world. That night, as I sat by the window, watching the lights of the town flicker like distant stars, I whispered a quiet thank you, not to fate, but to life itself, for giving me back my son, not as the man I lost, but as the man he was always meant to be. The winter that followed was one of the coldest our town had seen in decades. Snow layered the rooftops like a white blanket, and the air smelled of pine and distant fires. Most people stayed inside, bundled up, but I loved the quiet of those frozen mornings. The streets, empty and still, seemed to hum with memories, whispers of laughter, footsteps of old friends, echoes of life. Ethan and I opened the shop every morning, just like always. The heater would hum weakly in the corner while we brewed coffee, and talked about everything from the weather to the strange twists of fate that had brought us here. Sometimes we sat in silence, comfortable and unhurried, letting the sound of the ticking clock fill the gaps between words. One morning, as I was polishing a pair of old boots, Ethan said, You know, Dad, I used to think success was about how far you could go. Now I think it's about how deeply you can stay. I smiled. You're learning fast. He laughed. Guess I had a good teacher. There was peace in his eyes now, a steadiness I had never seen before. The sharp edges that once defined him had softened, replaced by gratitude. He had learned to live with less, and in doing so, had discovered more. But life, as it always does, had another turn waiting. One evening, a knock echoed at the shop door. After closing, I opened it to find a young woman standing there, shivering in the cold. Her coat was torn, her shoes soaked through. Please, she said, her voice trembling. I saw your light. Do you fix shoes? Ethan stepped forward gently. "Of course. Come in, miss." She sat down, explaining that she'd come from a nearby town looking for work. Her father had passed away, and she had no one left. She had walked for miles, hoping to find someone who'd hire her. While she spoke, Ethan fixed her shoes, carefully, patiently, like I'd taught him. When he finished, he said, "You said you're looking for work? We could use some help here, if you're willing to learn." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "Really? I'll do anything. I can clean, sweep." Ethan smiled. "You'll learn everything, starting with shoes." Watching him in that moment, I saw a reflection of myself from years ago, the same kindness, the same instinct to give. It was as if the wheel of life had turned full circle, and I was witnessing the continuation of something greater than either of us. Days turned into weeks, and the girl, whose name was Lily, became part of our small world. She was bright, curious, and quick to laugh. Ethan taught her patiently, often repeating the same lessons I'd once given him. "Every soul you fix deserves respect. You're not just mending shoes, you're mending journeys." Sometimes, as I watched them work together, I'd step outside, letting the winter air sting my face. I felt proud, not of what I'd achieved, but of what I was leaving behind. My legacy wasn't a fortune or a building. It was a man who had once lost everything and found his soul again. But my body was growing weaker. I could feel it in my bones, in the heaviness of my breath. The years had finally caught up with me. I didn't say anything at first, not wanting to worry Ethan. But one morning, as I was reaching for a shoebox on the top shelf, a wave of dizziness hit me. Before I knew it, the world tilted, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in the small hospital room, the same one where I'd once lain helpless years ago. But this time, I wasn't alone. Ethan was sitting by my side, his hands clasped tightly around mine, eyes red and weary. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking, "don't you dare leave me now." I smiled weakly. "I'm not going anywhere yet, but, son, life's telling me to slow down." He shook his head. "You're going to be fine. You have to be. We still have work to do." I squeezed his hand. "You already did the work, Ethan. You became the man I always hoped you'd be. That's more than enough." Tears filled his eyes, and for the first time since he was a boy, he buried his face against my arm, crying openly. I rested my hand on his head and whispered, "It's all right to cry. It's how the soul breathes." After a few days, I was discharged. My strength never fully returned, but I didn't need it. I spent most days sitting near the shop window, watching the world go by while Ethan and Lily worked. They laughed often, and every so often, Ethan would bring me tea, saying, "Rest, Dad. I've got this." And he did. The shop thrived, not because of business, but because of the warmth that filled it. People came just to feel that energy, to hear Ethan's gentle words, to watch Lily learn, to say hello to the old man in the corner who always smiled. One afternoon, as the golden sunlight spilled across the floor, Ethan came over and sat beside me. "Dad," he said softly, "you remember when I used to mock you for being poor?" I nodded. "I remember," he smiled faintly. "I was blind. You weren't poor at all. You had everything that mattered, and now I see it. I just wanted to say thank you for never giving up on me, even when I didn't deserve it." My throat tightened. I reached out and took his hand. "That's what fathers do, son. We see the man inside the boy, even when the world can't." He smiled and whispered, "You saved me, Dad." I looked out the window, watching the sun dip behind the hills. "No, son, you saved yourself. I just waited long enough for you to find the light." That night, after closing, Ethan and Lily sat with me as we shared a simple dinner. There was laughter, warmth, and a quiet joy that filled the room. I realized then that even if my time was nearing its end, I had lived fully, and my story, our story, would continue through them. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The world outside was still, painted in soft shades of blue. I looked around the shop, the walls lined with memories, the smell of polish, the tools neatly arranged. Then I whispered to the silence, "Thank you." When Ethan came in an hour later, he found me sitting peacefully in my chair, my hands folded, my face calm. He didn't cry right away. He just stood there, looking at me for a long time, then smiled through the tears that came later. That evening, he kept the shop open, just like I always did. People came by when they heard the news, neighbors, friends. even strangers whose shoes I'd once fixed. They shared stories, laughter, tears. Ethan spoke softly to the small crowd that gathered. My father wasn't just a shoemaker. He was a builder of souls. I used to mock him for what I thought he lacked. But now I know. He was rich in the ways that truly matter. He gave me back my life. Years later, people still talk about the old man and his shop, how his kindness shaped a generation. And on quiet nights, when Ethan closes the shop and turns off the light, he can almost hear my voice whisper, "Keep walking, son. Keep fixing what's broken." Because love, the kind built on forgiveness and time, never really dies. It simply changes hands.